recap. Yes, so maybe just to recap things a bit. So previously during our lab session, we dealt with this problem called back of MNIST digits. Basically, this is like a way for us to formulate the multiple instance learning for a problem in which we are given a group of images inside. We are given a group of images. We call each group unit as a bag, and inside this bag, we call them bag of instances. Inside this bag, we have images, which we use the term here instances. So each image inside each bag is one individual instance. When we also label like a group of images together based on some rule H during our first lab, the rule was that a bag is called positive if it contains more than 3 digits of 9, for example. Yes, so what we did before was where we extract back statistics for of features for all images inside the bag. We use that feature representation to train a classifier using simple single instance classifier, things like logistic regression. We can even apply other classifiers like support vector machines or random forests or other things. And also we can also compute nearest neighbor using set-based metric. We used Hausdorff distance before in order for us to compute the distance between this bag of instances. So this is what we did previously for each of the bag. With bag statistics, we extract a single representation for each of these bags. So bear in mind that each bag of images or each bag of instances here contain variable number of instances. So if we want to train an off-the-shelf single instance learning classifier, we have to transform them so that we have a single vector representation. And previously we did this with bag statistics. We can also, when we then for each bag we have like one representation, but previously when we applied nearest neighbor methods, we can also visualize it in this way, in which we describe a relation between each bag of instances by their distance, so we can ascribe the notion of closeness between them. So in a sense, it's like mapping them to some it's like finding a representation for them where we can find the distance between each one of them and compute nearest neighbor methods. Now, there is an alternative approach for this. So previously, if you remember, for our bag of MNIST digits, the rule is that if a bag contains more than 3 digits of 9, then it is considered positive. So one way to classify this is, of course, if we can classify the digits inside each bag. So if it contains X number of certain digits, in our case, we can classify each image inside our bag. If it contains a digit 9, then we can compute how many nines are expressed in our bag representation. Then if it goes above a certain threshold, then we can classify the bag as positive. So this is what we call in multiple instance learning literature as instance-based methods. In instance-based methods, we're trying to train an instance-based classifier, and we rely on two assumptions. The first assumption is that we have this process H to determine the class label of instances. When we say class label of instances, at least in this example of bag of MNIST digits, this class label of instances, they are something that must be related to the label of the bag as a whole. In this case, the label is the digit labels, like whether this is a picture of 3, the picture of 4, picture of 9. And we know that this is somewhat related to another process called capital H that will determine the back label from the class instances. So in our previous example, during our lab, this rule capital H is, we'll call them MI assumption, multiple instance assumption. And in our previous example, this rule is that if a bag contains at least 3 digits of 9, then it is positive. Otherwise, it's negative. So there is this rule capital H here. And typically, we in instance-based classifiers, we try to classify each instance. And after we classify each individual instance, we try to combine like these labels using what we call multiple instance assumptions. And maybe to illustrate this, let us take a look back at the mask problem. So I described this in during the start of this workshop. Maybe I'll describe this again just as a refreshment. So basically, we are given molecules. We want to smell whether we want to classify whether a given molecule is musky or not, meaning it has musky smell or it doesn't have musky smell. The thing is that each molecule is represented by various conformations. So this conformation is like the different arrangement of this molecule in three-dimensional space. The thing is we don't have a way to separate one conformation from the other. So when we observe a molecule as having musky smell, we are basically saying out of all the conformations of the molecules, some of them probably contribute to this muskiness. So this is an example of another molecule and the various conformations that they are associated with the molecules. And so we can, with instance-based methods, we can associate an instance label for each of this molecule. In this case, like a commonsensical approach is to assume that each of these molecule has a label being musky or not musky. We don't observe this label, but we can imagine that each of this conformation, each of the instance in the back contains such a label. In this case, each conformation can be musky or non-musky. When we do instance-based method, we'll try to learn this rule small h, which we can learn via classifier. So the classifier will tell us whether this instance is musky, whether that instance is non-musky. Of course, we don't have access to the label, but we can still do that anyway. Then after we have the labels, we can apply an assumption, a multiple instance learning assumption to learn H. In this example, perhaps it makes sense to think that a molecule is musky if it contains at least one conformations that is musky. So in this case, because we classify one of the conformations out of all the 4 conformations as musky, then we can say that this entire molecule is musky based on that rule. So what we do here is that we train an instance classifier. We train a classifier to classify the instance, and we combine the prediction using some assumptions. So the assumptions that I just described is called the standard assumption in multiple instance learning literature. And to formalize things, we would like to think this as each instance inside each bag. So each instance xij inside bag xi has a hidden label yij. Then the multiple instance assumption is created to combine how this label yij affects the ultimate bag label that we're trying to predict as yi. And one such assumption is the multiple instance standard assumption that we described before. So perhaps this picture on the right can illustrate that. As you see, we have like a series of positive bags and we have a series of negative bags. A positive bag is considered positive if it contains at least one positive instance under this assumption. So you can see this positive bag here contains at least one positive, while negative bags contain no positive instances at all. And so mathematically, we can express this rule as h capital rule, the rule h xi as the summation, as the maximum of all the instance labels. So there's a typo in this slide. Oops, that accidentally closed it. Sorry, let me reshare it. So we can think of this as we have an instance classifier small h that will take in all the instances and predict some probability, whether it's positive or negative. And to classify the bag as a whole, we just take the maximum of all these instance probabilities. So in the MOS dataset, we are tasked with detecting whether a molecule will exhibit drug activity, and if it is, it will produce this musky smell. So our task is just to tell whether a molecule is musky or not. And it's reasonable assumption to say that a molecule is musky if at least one valid conformation is musky. And so in this case, it's a good enough assumption for this problem. But the question is, of course, if it is good enough assumption to model other problems. And in fact, we can think of other problems as a form of instance-based classification. So this is not a problem that we can formulate as a multiple instance learning problem. Suppose we want to do object detection. And in this case, we are given a picture of cats. Of course, if we want to detect a cat, one way to do it, well, usually people don't do this, but we can also think of it like this. We are given patches of images. So by image patches, meaning you just like draw a rectangle here and you extract like the image from that small rectangular surface. And you can think of an image as being made up of these many rectangles. So if we want to detect whether an image contains a cat or not, for example, you'd want to see all the available patches, these many patches, and you one way to do it is that you predict whether a patch is relevant to predicting a cat or not a cat. And of course, under this problem, we cannot use the multiple instance learning standard assumption in which, because under that assumption, we think that this is a picture of a cat. If we observe at least one patch that contains like a body part of the cat, for example. But if we're given a picture of just an ear, for example, is it enough to classify that it is a cat, or does an image of cats have to have more things like the eyes, for example? Similarly, if we are given just a picture of the cat eyes, we probably won't know if this is an eye of a cat or an eye of other things. We need informations from all other patches. So in a way, that these multiple instance assumptions determines like or domain knowledge on the data, how we combine like all the various information from our instances to form the back labels. Let's look at various other valid assumptions from this task of classifying whether an image represents like whether a picture is a picture of a beach or not a beach. What is the relevant concept that we want to have when we see a picture of a beach? It needs to have a sand, it needs to have water, it probably needs to have both, right? Because like if we're just given a picture, if a picture only contains sand, then probably it's a desert. And if it's just water, it probably is a picture of the ocean. So we sort of need to have both concepts. So in here we can introduce some other assumptions to classify this problem. We have this thing called presence-based multiple instance assumption. And the difference between this and standard assumptions is that we can think of a bag as positive. In this case, we can think that this picture represents a picture of a beach. If it contains one or more instances that belong to a set of required instance level concept, meaning what? So mathematically, this just means that we have a set of concepts, then we try to classify each of the image patches, and we just compute if, so for each image, it must belong to like one concept. So in this case, like the concept is a water or a sand. So if it contains water, then we calculate that, then we increase the counter for the number of patches that contains water. At the end of the day, we just see if it contains all the relevant concepts and if it passes like a certain threshold. In this case, the threshold is 1. So if it contains at least one patch of water and one patch of sand, then it is a picture of a beach. Yes, so something like this. We classify this picture as picture of a beach if we detect at least one patch of water and at least one patch of sand. But of course, this might not be enough, right? Depending on how small you draw these patches are. You probably want to have more patches of sands, more patches of water, then you can of course, increase this number. So what you can do is you can split the image again into patches. You classify whether each patch is water, sand, or neither. Then you just compute like how many of them are present. You set some threshold for each of this. Like for example, you need 5 patches of water and seven patches of sand, and you try to see if the image contains that many patches as required. Then you classify it if it exceeds this quantity, otherwise it's not a picture of a beach. Yes, so it's a concept in here. There's another one is called count-based multiple instance learning assumption, in which we can also set a threshold. So I guess in this case it doesn't really make sense, but maybe if like say 90% of this image is water, then it's unlikely to be a picture of a beach, right? Because if a picture of a beach contains 90% water, probably like it's not a beach, probably it's something else. Because while the remaining 10% is not water, you don't really have any confidence that that belongs to a picture of a beach. Then you can set an upper threshold, of course, for this count. And if it lies between the threshold, then you consider it for the classification. So to summarize, right, for all these presence-based assumptions, what you want to do is first you need to define a certain concept. So depending on your task, you want to classify. So in this case, we are doing image classification. We want to classify whether an image is a picture of a beach or not. So we need to determine the relevant concepts. In this case, the relevant concept will be the presence of water and the presence of sand. We need to find a way to compute each concept, meaning we need to train a classifier that can detect whether a given patch contains water or if it contains sand. And after we do that, we can count their occurrences and find the optimal threshold for each concept. And after that, of course, we can classify whether this is a picture of a beach or not a beach. But of course, what's the problem here? More often than not, in a multiple instance learning problem, we're only given that this is a picture of a beach. We're not told that these patches here are patches of water. These are not. We probably need to have some auxiliary data source to do this. Or yeah, we probably sometimes like if we have like annotations on the patch level, sometimes like there are probably other ways that you can do this, but usually in multiple instance learning, you're not given the instance label. So sometimes it's a bit hard to combine them. So of course the question is, if we are not given these patch labels, then we can't reliably train a classifier, right? Without any additional data source to tell whether to perform instance-based classification. So the question is there an easier way to combine like these instance labels? And that brings us to a more pragmatic approach called the collective assumptions. So this assumption says that instead of trying to learn the concept, instead of trying to classify each patch separately, in this case, we want in the presence-based MI assumptions, we want to classify whether a patch is a picture of water or sand, whose labels we might not have access to. And instead of trying to classify the concepts, what we can do instead is that we can treat this as a single instance classification problem. We try to learn to predict the label given the instance. So that meaning like instead of predicting whether this instance or this patch of an image is belongs to class called concept called water or not, we can just simply assign an arbitrary label like, oh, this patch belongs to a bag that has a label beach, for example, or not a beach. That is what is meant by that. We can just train a classifier to predict the back label from the instance label directly, predict the back label directly, and then we use assumption that will combine like all these various probabilities to form like one prediction. Maybe to illustrate that, so instead of learning concept, so suppose like if this picture is a picture of a beach, then we label it as positive. Otherwise, it will be negative. Instead of learning the concept, for each of these patch, we can abstractly try to learn a classifier that will output a probability, whether with the probability of this patch belonging to a positive bag, or in this case, where this patch belongs to a picture of a beach, given the patch, and we can output a probability on that. So in this case, like, because this is a picture of water, water can be anywhere else, can be ocean, can be a bathtub, or can be a beach, but we're not very certain of that. So in isolation, we'll give like a probability of 0.3 to this patch. But a picture of a sand, for example, probably is more telling of that this is part of a picture of a beach. So we'll assign higher probability to that, say 0.8. Then the collective assumption deals with how we combine all these probabilities together. So under this method, we're going to classify each patch separately, assign them probability, and we apply assumption. So one such assumption is we can assume that each instance contribute equally. So in this case, we can just take average of the probability. And so the probability of these two patches together will be average 0.55. So this is the probability that this is a picture of a beach, which we obtain by averaging all the probability of each instance. We can do slightly better. We can try to learn some weightage associated. So depending on the patch, we can try to learn some function that will assign like different weightage to here. So because like, for example, like a sand is more indicative of a beach. So we don't want to assume that they contribute equally. So meaning like if the probability that this patch is higher, we want to assign higher weightage instead of like just normal averaging. We can also do that. But of course, the question is, we must learn this function omega xij that will assign the weight. But this is something that in practice can be done. Another way to combine this is to assume that each of these patch are independently distributed. So in the case of an image, this might not be the case, of course, because we know that the image patches that belong to the same image are correlated. But for the purpose of this example, we can assume as such. We suppose that they're independent. And if they're independent, we can write a likelihood function that relates the probability of each of this. We can relate the likelihood function that each of these patch is sampled from a particular bag, for example. Then to find the probability that this bag is labeled positive, or that this picture is a picture of a beach given the bag or given like all these patches, we can use Bayes' rule. So basically we can compute this quantity here. You can look at the slides later. I won't go through the derivation per se, but technically under Bayes' rule, you can sort of infer this quantity to be directly proportional to the quantity over here. So in a way, like to compute the probability that this bag is positive, you just need to compute this probability over here. And this can easily be computed. The probability of seeing a positive instance, you can just assume this to be the proportion of positive pictures or the picture of beaches in your training sets, multiply by the product that each of the patch here belongs to the positive class or picture of a beach, for example. So of course, like the problem is we cannot really compute this quantity P of xij here, but there is no problem because if we are just dealing with binary classification problem, or like even if we have more than two classes, but for this example, say for we can also compute like yes. So this is how we can also compute the probability that a picture is negative, is not a picture of a beach given the patches of images, and we'll have the same quantity over here. if you see like this quantity over here is similar to the quantity when we want to find the probability that the back is positive. And this term pxig appears in both expression. So when comparing which one has the highest probability, we can just cancel them out. And so in the end, we're left just to compute this quantity, this product of like, the prior probability that a randomly sampled like image is an image of a beach multiplied by the individual instance probability. If this is higher than this quantity over here, then we classify this picture as a picture of a beach, for example. Alternatively, because if you have a lot of instances, this number here tends to be very small and we'll have like a lot of errors. We can approximate this by another expression called the sum rule, which is like a numerical approximation of this. That is more stable. You can just think of this as taking logarithm of terms above, but they're basically similar in this case. So up to here, is there any question?
Yeah, small question. So when you put like probability of the class label given xij, right? So inherently the xij will also take into account the position of the pixel, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, there is something. I mean, it depends on how you represent it. I mean, like
Yeah,
if you
because
just take the patch, like it won't have that, right?
yeah, because I am thinking because if all of I'm just wondering how all these features right are fed into the classifier, because if it's like in this case it will be 8 times 8, right?
Yes.
So I am thinking that maybe if it detects that bottom left is always sand, as in like it always has the data that is representative of sand, then will it actually bias the classifier to say that, oh, if let's say my most bottom right pixel is always sand, maybe it has a higher probability of it being a beach or something like that.
Oh, will it have that problem? So first, I think, right, so I'm not saying that this particular approach is good for this problem, of course. But suppose we want to do this approach, right, to classify whether this is a picture of a beach, right? First, because you treat each instance independently, right? I don't think like you have the position information. And even if it has, right, say it always detect that the bottom left is always a sand. The way you combine this together is that in principle, if you have a lot of patches, this should somewhat be regularized by like the presence of other patches because you're multiplying the probability together, I guess. So like
Oh,
if this is present in all images, then probably it won't be as informative, right?
okay, okay, yeah, I get what you
Yeah.
mean. Yes.
Yeah, but later on we're going to implement this, I guess, like to make it clearer, I guess. But for now, just know that the way we just know that this method can work because like even though we don't have the label for the instance, we know that an instance belongs to like we know in this case whether an instance belongs to a positive back or a negative back. So technically you can train a classifier to output the back probability given the instance, and whether that approach is good or not depends whether like this product rule or sum rule is, I guess, captures whether the assumption is good enough to captures like the data that we have.
Yeah, but in basically for this example, right, it doesn't actually consider the order of the pixel, right?
Yes.
Okay, okay, sure.
Yep. I don't think it will work in this example. I'm just using this, I guess, like to
Or there
illustrate
could be
this.
other methods that can
Yeah.
incorporate that, right? Okay, sure.
Because right, like yeah, for this particular example, I was thinking like, so I do have like something is more related to this, I think, but usually like it involves more domain knowledge, I guess, which makes it a bit harder. Uh, yeah, so this is just as illustration. Obviously, like this might not be relevant. I mean, like this assumption might not work well for this image because like here we are assuming independence between each of the instance, which is not the case, right? In this particular example. Yeah. Yeah. So okay, so sorry. So let's just skip to this slide. Yeah, so we've gone through the sum rule and product rule. We're going to try to implement that during the lab sessions. Probably it will be a bit clearer then. But for now, like I'm going to introduce like another method. Basically, like all of us probably have worked with logistic regression at some point. It's a popular classifier, and basically what it does is, given a class, like usually a binary class of 0 or 1, this logistic regression will output a probability that, given a feature of that, given a feature x, it will output the probability that whether the feature belongs to like a class 0 or 1. And it does so by learning this weight vector w that will multiply with our feature x, and we just pass it through the sigmoid function. What's more about this method is that this model actually assumes this relation. It assumes that the locouts of the probability, so pi is the probability that a particular x belongs to, that this data point belongs to class 1. So 1 minus pi is the probability that this belongs to class 0. It assumes that the log of the odds ratio, this ratio here, is actually proportional to x. So this is what we mean when we do logistic regression. So previously, I've talked about multiple instance assumptions. So the collective assumptions that I showed previously, the product rule here, for example. Here, we're assuming that the instance label, or at least like the probability that a specific instance belonging to a class is independently distributed. And that's why like we can come up with this rule to combine the probability of the instance level. So in a sense that this model is determined by the multiple instance assumptions. The same way as our logistic regression is defined by specifying this relation between the probability of the positive class and the negative class. So the idea is that, can we repurpose a logistic regression classifier to learn this idea? And apparently the answer is yes. So I have the derivations here, which you probably can go through later. But if we define the instance probability Pij, so this is the probability that the j instance of the back I, or instance xij here, has belongs to a positive back. So if we define this Pij as this quantity here, probability that the specific instance belongs to a positive back, with logistic regression, we can create a sigmoid function, learn a weight w that will, when multiplied with xij and pass it through sigmoid function, will give us this probability Pij. So if we define the log odds of the probability that a given back is of positive class, if we define the log of the ratio of the probability that the given back is positive to the probability that it is negative, if we define it as the average of the log odds of the probability of its instance level, apparently we can derive this and appear at the and we can arrive at this interesting conclusion that this is actually equivalent with just applying logistic regression on the average of the features. So if you remember like our previous approach with the back statistics, in which when we are given a back, we just average the features of all the instances. Apparently, if we do that and we train a logistic regression, it is actually equivalent to defining a logistic regression for instance-based methods, in which we define the probability of the back to be related to the instance in such a way. In the sense that we define that we have the assumptions that the log of the ratio of the probability of the back to be equals to the average of the log of the ratio of the probability on the instance level. So again, like we will revisit this again during the lab sessions. So yeah, actually, if you have any questions like on this, maybe like if it's not clear, you can ask me now. Otherwise, I'll move on again. Yeah. Okay, so if there's no question, I'll move on. So yes, so here the logistic regression model is defined with this relation. This is our multiple instance assumptions, where we define the log odds of the ratio of the probability that a back is positive to the ratio that a back is negative. It's just the average of the probability of each instance in which the when we say probability of each instance, we mean that is a probability that an instance belongs a positive cause over the probability of the instance belonging to a negative cause. If we just define this relation, and this is equivalent to just training a logistic regression on the mean features of the back. And this assumption here is what we mean by collective assumption, in the sense that we are trying to link the probability on the back level to the probability on the instance level. And of course, this is like just one way of assuming this. We can come up with different rules. For example, we can define the probability that a back is positive as 1 minus the as this quantity here. Basically, this is the NOR assumption. We're saying that probability that a back is positive will increase if we assume that at least one of the is equal to the probability that at least one of the instances is positive. And with more instance days being positive, this quantity will increase. Uh, Then we have the standard multiple instance assumption, in which like the probability of the back is just the maximum of the probability on the instance level. Can take simple averaging, can take softmax. So basically we can just come up with the multiple instance assumption, and we can just see which one like gives us the best result, essentially. Another method that has been developed in this field is probably one of the most famous one, is this thing called diverse density. This assumes instances between positive backs to be clustered around a prototype point, and that negative instances are likely to be far from this point. So under this method, we assume that we have there's this prototype T. So this T is like some random point in space that is shared like between all the positive backs. Meaning like if you have positive backs, it will contain like instance that is very close to this point T. So in this case, perhaps like if you see the lines on the right, this represents like the instances inside each back. So you see positive back 1 and 2, they intersect at this point. So this point is like the prototype T that we mentioned here is like the common point that is shared between all positive backs. And so under that assumption, we are trying to define the probability of each instance as belonging to a positive class if it is very close to T. That's why like in this paper, with this method, the author defines like this Pij, or the probability that the instance belonging to a positive back, to be proportional to to be equivalent to this exponential of its negative distance from T. Meaning like if xij is very close to T, if this instance around this point will have like a probability that is close to 1, essentially. The interesting thing about this method is that T is something that we learn. So we try to learn T from our data. So this is something that we learn, and xij is something that we observe. And if we assume if we assume that each backs are identically distributed, and if we assume each instance is also identically distributed, then we can come up with this likelihood function, in which the likelihood of our data is described by the probability of the is just by the product of the probability of the likelihood of all the positive backs and the likelihood of all the negative backs. And we define the likelihood of the probability of the positive backs as this quantity here. Basically, this is just saying like at least one of the instances is positive. While here, the probability of the negative vec is just saying like none of the instance in the negative vecs are positive. So we just multiply this quantity together, and this quantity over here, P of xij plus given t and P of xij minus given t, is given by the expression in here. So when we try to maximize the likelihood, what we're doing is that we're finding a point t that will be very close to all the to at least some of the instances in the positive vec, and at the same time will be very far from the instance in the negative vec. So basically in this diagram, we're trying to find like an intersection between the positive vecs, and we hope that this intersection is something that is far from the instances in the negative vec. And we can learn this like in principle using gradient-based method. So we define this loss function, and we just try to optimize this iteratively. We can even incorporate another parameter, scaling parameter S, that we can learn as well to scale like each features, so that each features here, so that with high dimensional data, like maybe some of the dimensions are not very useful, we can just like make it less important in this expression over here. Yes, so that brings us to the second lab session. But before that, if any of you have any question, like feel free to ask. Meanwhile, I'm going to copy the link of the second lab in the chat. Mhm. Oh yes, I didn't see a question from Andy Gore. So Andy Gore asked, can we similarly treat MIL as an object detection by considering a back as one instance? The examples that I gave previously treat MIL as an object detection by considering a back as considering a back as one image and the patches as the instances inside the back. So we can try to make some prediction on the instance level and find a way to combine them together so that we can make the final prediction for object detection. We can also perhaps try to do the instances need not be patches of image. If you can do some pixel level clustering, for example, you can also treat separate clusters as being different instances and so on. Anyway, I'm going to copy the link for the lab 2 in on the chat. So yeah, so maybe click on that and we can begin with the second lab session. Okay. Yep, so I hope you can see my screen. Yes, so as before, like if you attended the first lab session, you're probably more familiar with this. If you didn't, no problem. I'm going to guide you through this again. So remember with this collab notebook, you can just run like each cell by pressing Shift Enter on the selected cell. So as before, I want you to to run the first cell, because this will copy this will copy from GitHub the data that we need to use for this lab session. We just run that, and if you're asked if you trust this notebook, just trust it, because yeah, I didn't put anything harmful in there. So previously we did this with the first lab. So the thing with collab session is that every time you open a new session, like you won't see the data that you cloned before. So you need to redo this, but this should be quite fast, yes. And after you refresh it, you'll see this GitHub repository MI workshop being cloned in here. And it contains the data that we need. So let's just run a couple more cells, run the importing cells, set some random sets so that this result is applicable, is replicable to everyone. And let's run this data loading cells in here. So what this code will do is this will load all the data that we need to run this experiment. And if you don't remember, let me remind you again of what the data that we're dealing with. So we are dealing with image data as before. Actually, maybe I can share the slides for the lab first, just to remind everyone what this is about. So the setting here will be similar to lab 1, in which we are given, like, we will be working with MNIST digits again. We'll group like several images together and call them backoff instances in this case. Each back will contain variable number of digits, and I will assign arbitrary label 1 or 0 depending on the contents of the image inside. And our goal is to learn a rule that I use to classify the back as positive or negative, basically. Yep. So if we return back to the lab, so all of the variables here that I'm using will correspond to that backoff image representation. And if you're wondering where the images are in this MNIST array train. So if you see, this is just an array, but if you do this code plt.im show, and we're going to visualize like the first row of this array, reshape it because it's an image. It'll give you an image. So each row of MNIST train or MNIST test, this is just like an image stored in array. But working with image data is slightly more computationally involved, even though this MNIST data is quite small, because we don't have that many computing power with Google Colab. So what I did instead is, instead of MNIST array train, I provided you with this array X train, which essentially has the same shape. So if you print the shape of both of this array, you see that they have the same number of rows. This is because X-train is a compressed version of MNIST array train. Each row of MNIST X-train corresponds to the same row in MNIST array train. And this X-train is these are the features that we're going to use. Next variable of interest will be this thing called trainbacks and testbacks. So with trainbacks, if you print it, so trainback is an array of arrays, as you can see. So if you print trainback 0, it will give you several indices. So these indices belong to the row in Xtrain. And the way you can extract like the relevant features is by typing Xtrain square bracket, trainbacks square bracket, then you put the row number that you want. So in this case, let's put row number 0s. And this will subsection this array Xtrain to you and give like the necessary amount of rows that you need for this. So So this is to say that the first back of this train backs contains 6 instances. And the way you get these instances is by passing these indices to X train. So you see this X train, after you pass the indices from train backs, will give you the the relevant features that you need to for that back number 0. Whereas the label for the back is given by this variable called train labels. So in this case, if you just run train label square bracket 0, you see that it is labeled 0, meaning that this particular back X train, this particular back number 0 have a label 0 and it has 6 instances, and each instance has 64 features. So up to here, is there any question regarding this representation or something that you wish to clarify? Yeah, just ask me. Yeah, so if there are no questions, let us begin. As before, let us try to visualize the distribution of the labels in both sets. You can do this by typing this. You can just follow me. So what I'm doing here is that I'm trying to create 2 plots. And we're going to plot the label distribution between the test set and the train set. So you can just type this. And this will show you, sorry, not imshow. You should do access.hist because we want to see histogram. And this will show you 2 histograms. You see this first histogram is of the train set. You see there are roughly 2,800 perhaps of class 0. And there are roughly 1,800 of class 1. And the ratio seems to be proportional between train labels and test labels. Next, we can copy the cell, and we want to visualize how many instances each back contain. And you can do this by typing this. So what we're doing here is that we're trying to find how many instances in each bag contain in train bags and how many instances are there in each bag in test bags. And again, we're showing the histogram. So the first one here belongs to the train sets, second one here belongs to the test set. And we see they have roughly the same number of instances distribution roughly between each bag. So now that we know that these 2 bags are somewhat similar, we can then be confident that if we have a good result on a train set, hopefully it will translate to the test set. Same as before, I've created this function to visualize each bags. So you just have to run this cell and you run this function, visualize bags, pass MNIST array train, then you pass train bags, you pass the train labels, and you put how many bags you want to visualize. In this case, let's just visualize 5. You press enter, and this function will create a plot for you. Same as before, this plot will show you what are the instances contained in each back. So the first 2 here are back label 1s. These are the instances. The rest are zeros. These are the instances. So I'll give you maybe 5 minutes to play around with this. Try to find the relation between the instance contained inside the back label 1 and the the relationship between the instance in back label 0, and probably you can try to deduce what is the rule that I use to create these data sets. So I'll just give you 5 minutes. And yeah, you can play around a bit. And if you want to go to toilet during this time, probably it's a good time too. Yeah, I'll be back. Yes, so I'm back, everyone. So yeah, maybe if any of you notice what is the rule being used here, you can just say it or type in the chat if you're shy. Or yeah, if you didn't notice, basically the rule for this data set is simple. If the data contains at least 1-digit 9, then the back will have a label 1. But if the back doesn't contain any image of 9, then it will be labeled 0. So it's quite simple, really, for this one, compared to our first step, in which it needs to have at least 3 digits of 9, for example. Yes, and so now let's try to work with this representation. Try to run this. Now let's run this thing here. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to extract some summary statistics just as before, because we want to see. So previously in lab 1, I walk you through a back statistics methods in which we just extract summary statistics for each feature, and it worked relatively well before. So as a benchmark, we want to see if it works relatively well now too. So let's do that. Let's extract some summary statistics. Let's call it extract stats. And to do that, we just call this function just as before. So if you didn't do lab 1, you might be slightly confused. So I'll explain this as we go, but just for now, maybe you can just type what I typed in here. We posit xtrain. We post train backs, and for the summary functions, again, post a group of functions. For this, let's try to pass the mean function, the variance function, and the kurtosis function, like what we did before. Let's do the same thing with xtest. We just copy this and replace train with test, xtest, test backs. Okay, let's put an equal sign here. So these two functions will extract the summary statistics, basically the mean, the variance, and the kurtosis from xtrain stats and xtest stats. So it will do that. And afterwards, we can try to visualize the PCA representation of this. Oh, so remember, for PCA to work, we need to scale the input. We need to scale the input by subtracting the mean and dividing by the standard deviation. In Python, we usually do this by calling the standard scalar object. So we can define a scalar object, standard scalar, and we will fit it with our training data, xtrain stats. Then we can create xtrain stats normed, which is the normalized version, by calling a transform method from our fitted scalar object to xtrain stats. Do the same with xtest stats norm. Scalar.transform xtest stats. So after we scale it, we want to run PCA on it. So we can create a PCA object called PCA. Then we do fit xtrain stats norm. And same as the scalar object, we create xtrain PCA by calling PCA object transform to xtrain stats norm, and do the same for xtest. So if you've managed to run this, you can also run like the code chunk below. You can just uncomment this and try to visualize the representation we have here. So I'll give you some time maybe to copy this code and try to run this. Yeah, if you encounter any problem, let me know. Maybe I'll wait like 1 to 2 minutes for this. Okay, so if you didn't encounter any problem, let's go through the visualization. As you can see, we know that the assumption between in this one is that we only need one instance of 1-digit 9 in order for us to label whether back is positive or not. So the thing with this is that each back that contains a digit 9 or is labeled positive might not have that image as the dominant images inside the backs, right? It might or it might not have. That's why tendency is when we extract things like the mean or the variance or the kurtosis, like it tends to not give us a very good picture of the distribution of everything. So if you see, this is not really represented well. As you can see, like the orange dots, the orange points are interspersed with the blue ones. Like we don't really see separation between them. And if you run the other code chunk below, which is essentially the same visualization, but for the test data, we'll see similar things. Like they're basically distributed randomly. Now, if you run the code below and uncomment this chunk, well, what this do is it will run logistic regression with various summary statistics combination through this data set and try to do classification. It's not bad. We get about 77% balance accuracy in general, which is not bad. But if we compare this to the performance of our previous back statistics method with labels that they can easily with different labels. Basically, previously if you remember, the labels is that if you have at least 3 digits of 9, then the back is positive. This method seems to work better, in fact, because like the assumption basically is more suited to the way we do things here. Here we just extract the mean, the variance, and the kurtosis of the instance inside the backs, and because like positive vec in here might not necessarily have a lot of digits of 9, that's why features is then like less informative, right? In this case, still somewhat our model can still like predict to some degree of accuracy, but it's still not good enough. Can we do better? Next, we can also try to run this function. If you remember previously, we also did Hausdorff distance. We can do the same with this. So you can compute. You can run this. You can run this function to get like the distance. Well, in this case, this will take a bit longer because now we have more backs. So maybe if you're free, you can run it. But here I've recorded the results that you will expect from running it. Basically, if we just use nearest neighbor method with the back, we just get slightly higher improvements maybe about 79%, 78%, just slightly better than before, basically. And it's not much better than just like extracting the back statistics, which is easier to do than computing this nearest neighbor distance. This is to say that the problem with this is because like we only have very few instance. We know that there's only one instance that is probably responsible for generating the back labels, and I'm going to make use of this idea and show how instance-based classifier can perform quite well for this class of problem, really. So now we're going to train an instance-based classifier. So if you don't remember the various rules that we can try to do that, here I've copied the equations from the slides. Basically the quantities that we need to compute. So we're going to try this thing called product rule. So if you remember, the product rule is given, so the quantity that we want to find here is a probability that a back is positive or a back is negative, given the instances. And if you remember, that quantity is proportional to this product of the positive backs multiplied together, of the prior probability that a back is positive multiplied together, multiplied by the probability that an instance belongs to a positive or a negative back. So essentially, since we know that these two quantities are proportional to this, what essentially we need to compute is just the second row here. Is just like this third and fourth row here. For probability that the back is positive, we just need to compute this probability, the prior probability of positive backs, to the power of the number of instances in that back, multiply that the probability on the instance level. So what we don't have right now is this probability here, the probability that the back is positive or negative given its instance. But this, we can train a classifier to do that. And we're going to do just that. So our objective now is we're trying to learn a classifier that will, given an instance from a back, we want to say that we want to have a measure of confidence. We want to have a probability that that instance belongs to a positive or negative back. And then we're going to combine that probability with this product rule or sum rule. To do that, we need to create a training labels for the instance. Okay, give me a moment. So remember that our instance is given by X train, right? And we only have labels on the back level. So what we can do here is we can create a Y instance spread. We just set it to be zeros to the length of X train. This means that we want to train this quantity probability that a given back is positive, that a given instance belong to positive or negative backs. And to do that, we need to have a data that basically says that, oh, this instance belongs from a positive back or negative back. So if you remember, our instance is given by this X train, and we have 20,000 of them. So we need to have a label for each of these instance, which back they come from, whether it's positive back or negative back. And the way we do that is we can first create this variable y instance train, which contains all zero. Then we'll go through the back label. So we can go through this quantity. So for back and label in zip train backs, train labels. So what this will do, this loop will do, is it will go through each back in the train backs and each label in the train labels. So if you remember, our train backs contain like the group of indices. So train back 0 are the indices in X train that belongs to the first back here. So what we can do is we can modify this Y instance train. We can modify like the relevant row that belongs to that instance. So in this case, we pass back equals to label, because we want each instance that is inside this back to have a label that is the same as the back. So we just pass this. We run the cell, and we have Y instance train that will essentially contain like the back labels associated with the instance. So remember, this label here is not the instance label per se, but what we need to learn is just the back label given the instance. So after we have this Y instance train here, we can train an instance classifier using a logistic regression model. We call .fit posit x train, and we pass Y instance train here as the training data, and there we go. We have an instance classifier that will basically predict whether a given instance comes from a positive or negative back. Yep. So once we have this instance classifier here, what we can do is we can make prediction for all instance in test data and in training data. We can make prediction for all instance in the test data. So we can have y test instance prediction equals to instance classifier dot predict probability x test. So what this will do is this will output. So if you run this and you print the value of this y test instance, this contains the probability of each instance belonging to the positive or negative back. So for the first instance here, we see that it has 64% chance of belonging to negative back, 35% chance of belonging to positive back. Of course, this alone is not enough, and we need to combine it with the product rule or sum rule. So I've created the code here to combine the probability. So if you want to run it, you can just comment out this line. And you can just execute this function. Okay, so you need to run this cell first. Then you run this. Then this will execute. This will basically just run like your y test instance prediction. So this is the prediction of individual test instance. What we want to do is we want to apply multiple instance learning assumption to combine the probability on the instance level according to some of this rule. So if you remember, this is the sum rule, this is the product rule, and we want to use them to combine. So I've written the code here, which basically would do this. We will compute this probability of positive just by measuring like the proportion of our training data that is positive. The same with negative. And this probability here, we learn through the instance classifier. So after combining, we see like higher results actually compared to, we see like slightly better results compared to when we apply like the back-based methods, which just give us like at most 78%. Here we have a slight improvement at 82.7% using the sum rule. So here the product rule doesn't do is not really performing well, and that's mostly because when we're trying to estimate this quantity and we have a lot of instance inside each bag, this probability tends to be very small. And so this will be a better numerical approximation to this. Instead of the product rule, we can use the sum rule. And we see we get a slightly better performance at 82.7%. Yeah, so up to here, is there any question? Okay, so if there's no question, I'll go through the next section. So for the next one, I'm going to apply a logistic regression model. I'll probably go through like the details of this implementation during lab 3 because this involves implementing this framework called PyTorch. So I don't know if some of you is familiar with this, but basically this framework allows us to do gradient-based optimization, and hence like this gives us the flexibility on modeling like the multiple instance learning problem. Maybe I'll go through as I'm running this code. So you can run these first two cells here. Then you can run this code chunk here. Basically, this will take a while. Like this is probably the longest code that you'll ever run. But bear with me. I'm going to walk you through on how this is being implemented. Basically, what we are running here is just a simple logistic regression model, but we modify it a bit because we know that the problem that we're dealing with is we're given back of instances and we only have one label for this group of instances, and the way we classified so far is that we try to predict the probability for each instance and try to combine them together. With this logistic regression, we are applying this assumption called the maximum assumption or the multiple instance learning standard assumption. And the way it works is that it will score the probability for each instance, but it will only take the instance with the highest probability to output the probability on the back level. And the benefit of doing things this way is that your model will be able to recognize which instance contributes the most to the prediction. And if we set it such that it will predict for all instances, but only output the probability, but only output the final probability for the instance that is the most responsible, it will then learn how to uh, assign like importance to each of the instance features from, and we can sort of learn this end to end because like ultimately we only have one back label, but we have many instance labels and we only need one of them actually. And with this gradient based methods, we can sort of like just tell our model to predict the probability for each instance and take the maximum, and only update like update the model parameters based on that one probability that is responsible. uh yeah, and somehow this yeah, as you can see, like, so if you run this will run a while, but you can see the performance improvements in this case because with this assumption sort of captures like the data generation process better than the other approaches that we have used so far. And the benefit of doing of working with this torch framework is that you can easily code this multiple instance learning assumption better and more flexibly and just train a model that can like learn that yeah, from end to end. So yeah, let's just wait a bit for this model to finish running. Anyway, if you have any question, just feel free to ask me questions, or you can just type on the chat if you're shy. Also, if you haven't finished running some part of it, or if you're confused with this, yeah, I can send you the updated notebook later. So it seems like we encounter some error here. Oh, okay. I know the error. Okay, so we're supposed to delete this. So our model has finished training here, so there's no problem even if we encounter this error. We can just create another cell and run the model again. Basically, I think the problem here is you're supposed to omit this max indices variable, and you can just run prediction. And yeah, as you can see, we achieve like much higher accuracy than before. We get about 87.5% accuracy and 86% balance accuracy, compared with the previous sum rule that only has 82.7%, and the back-based method that gives us high is only 78.7%. You can of course change this assumption. Instead of max, you can change this to min. And so instead of just taking the maximum probability of the instead of just taking the maximum probability of the instance, you can take the average of all the instance and output a probability instead. But of course, like with the current data that we have, this is not going to do very well. I'm not gonna run it, but if you are interested, you can just like uncomment like these cells below and you can run it yourself. But basically with this method, we've achieved like much higher results than before. But the benefit of this is that, so one of the most important reason as to why we want to apply instance-based classifier is that if you remember the way we classify this logistic regression, classify this the way this logistic regression classify whether back is positive or not is because it takes in it scores a probability for each instance, and it only takes the maximum one of all the instances based on our assumption, and we output a probability, if you remember. But that also means that we can know which instance has the highest probability, and we can visualize that particular instance. And if we do just that, so you can run this cell right here to obtain the indices. So this is our results from before. Now the code chunk below it will take all the probability, all the backs that it considers as being positive, and it will see which instance is responsible for that prediction. And if we do that, and we print for the top 5 prediction, we can see that the model actually is able to recognize which instance is responsible for the back being labeled as positive. In this case, we know for sure that the back is labeled positive if it contains at least one digit of 9. And because this model will only output the probability of the instance that has the highest probability inside each back, we can then tell which instance is responsible for the prediction of the back. And this allows us to pick out the responsible instance in each back. In this case, it seems to be able to recognize the concept that we have. So more often than not, like in multiple instance learning problem, we're not given instance labels. We're only given back labels, but still sometimes we want to know which instance contributes to prediction. And with instance-based methods, this is actually possible. Even if we're not using this, even if we're using the product rule or sum rule methods, if you notice, like each of these methods we'll have this quantity of probability of being positive given the instance. So probability that the instance belonging to positive or negative back. Say you have an accurate prediction. Then this also means that you can zoom in on the individual instance and find out which one is responsible. So this is actually quite important for real life applications. So you can imagine this as something like you want to classify whether, say, I don't know, a CT scan, for example, or a CT scan of someone. You want to detect some disease from it, but your model can output like a prediction that, oh, this scan belongs to someone with a disease. But often you also want, as a doctor, for example, you want to know why the model like makes this prediction, which regions in the image, for example, contributes to this prediction. So with instance-based methods, you can actually derive something like this. You can pick out, you can sort of highlight which instance contributes to prediction, and sometimes this will give you that interpretability that sometimes are not present with machine learning based systems. So you can even see like, you can even look at the prediction, at the negative prediction, meaning like what the model considers to be negative, and see like which instance that contributes the most. And yeah, although this is not as meaningful, but yeah, you can see that among all these bets, they don't, the highest probability is never 9. Yeah. So yeah, so that'll be all for lab 2. It's a relatively short one. So is there any question up to now?
Yeah, I just want to compare this to lab 1. If
Okay.
lab 1 we actually use maximum instead,
Mm-hmm.
will we still arrive at similar results? As in like we still can get similar outputs to the
For
945, like what you produce, right?
this one.
Yeah.
Oh, so the thing is, right, with lab 1, we don't do instance-based classifier. If you remember when we,
Yeah, but we summarize the backspace on the average, right?
oh, right.
Yeah, that's the question that I wanted to ask. Like, I mean, I get what you mean by we don't use instance,
Mm-hmm.
but the logic flow behind it, if we use maximum, it would have been the
Okay.
same. As in, like the conclusion
Yes.
they arrived to would have been similar, right? Because if we put maximum,
Yes, you can probably, yeah, you can probably find out which instance contributes to it. Yeah, although it's not as explicitly as this, I
yeah,
guess.
it's
Yeah.
not explicitly as this one. Okay, sure.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, you're right in saying that. Yep. Okay. Yeah. If is there any other question? Okay. Yeah, maybe to add on to your point, right? I guess like with the nearest neighbor methods, you can indeed like, if we just take the maximum, you can like find out which pair contributes a distance the most. Uh, Probably what is absent is the score for each instance, because like for in this case, like you can actually have a score for each individual instance, like how much they contribute to the back. So I guess this way you have a more, how to say, your result is more on the, you have better scoring, I would say. Like you can assess like each instance, like how much they contribute to it, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're right in saying like, yeah, with the back you can also have that kind of interpretation. Anyway, uh, yeah. So that's it for lab 2. We're going to have like uh, a bit more after this, but maybe we can have like a short toilet break, maybe 15 minutes. Then we can gather here again, and yeah, then I'll continue with the rest. We don't have a lot left, I think. Just make couple more slides and have lab 3, which is like roughly around this long as well. Yep. So yeah, let's resume at 2:35. Yes. Okay, give me a moment. Yep. Okay. So let's recap what we have learned so far. So far we have gone through some examples of multiple instance learning problem. We have also gone through two main methods to deal with it. The first one is called instance-based method. In instance-based methods, we usually perform the main learning process usually happens at the instance level. The idea in this group of methods is that we want to learn a function that assigns class labels to instances after we have the class label to instances. So usually this class labels represents a probability whether each instance belong to a particular class, whether it belongs to positive class or negative class, depending on the problem at hand. Then we try to combine those probability by applying multiple instance assumptions. The benefit of this method is that sometimes when we do have domain knowledge, sometimes when we know how a process is generated, for example, like in the case of classifying whether a picture contains a cat or not a cat, or whether a picture is a picture of a beach or not, we do know what instances are required to derive that predictions. And so when we have our domain knowledge, sometimes this method might work better, while when we're not, when taking an aggregate of the back works, usually we can just apply back-based methods in which the main learning process happens at the back level. And the goal here is to approximate functions that consider each back as one entity without needing to assign a label to individual instances. So usually with back-based methods, we are more concerned towards classifying whether a given back is labeled positive or negative. And usually with back-based methods, we are also interested in finding a back representation that we can simply apply single instance classifiers to it, which makes the problem simpler and we don't have to reinvent anything. Now, during last lab, we worked with a logistic regression model that we have applied multiple instance assumption on. Let us look at that particular class of model in this way. So we are given n data points, right? So this is normal logistic regression with binary labels 0 or 1. For the ith data point, we're also given m features. So we can label these features as xi1, xi2 to xim. And ultimately what we compute is this quantity, which is just the multiplication of each of these features with some weight vectors that we associate with each feature, and we plus some constant. And after we have this function, we apply what we call the sigmoid activation function that basically transforms this entire quantity into a number between 0 and 1. And because it is between 0 and 1, we can consider this number as probability, which usually what we're interested in finding when we are working with logistic regression. So if you look at the schematic on the right, this is one way to describe this model. We have m features and we have m feature vectors. So when we pass these m features to these layers containing m feature vectors, and when we pass it through this layer, what we do is we simply do a multiplication between these m features and m weight vectors. We apply summation operation, apply activation function. And after we apply the sigmoid activation here, or the activation function in here, that gives us the probability. We can compute what we consider error or loss function. So we can compute this loss function for each data point. And the most commonly used loss functions is perhaps the cross entropy loss. Here, this is the description. This is the formulation, the mathematical definition of the cross entropy loss, which is these terms here: yi times log yi. So y hat I here is the probability derived by our model. plus this other probability quantity here. But what this function does is basically, so yi is either 0 or 1, right? When your label is 1, you want your probability yi hat here to be as close to 1 as possible. And when this thing is 1, the log of 1 is 0, and so this loss is minimized. On the other hand, when this yi is 0, you want 1 minus yi, which is the probability that 1 minus yi hat, this quantity 1 minus yi hat here is a probability that your data point belongs to class 0. Of course, you want this to be as small as possible. And so if yi is 0, so this first quantity here is 0, this will be 1. This 1 minus yi hat, if we want it to be optimized, this yi hat should be 0 because it's class 0. We want to predict it to be 0. And so this will be 0 and the loss is minimized. So on the other hand, meaning when this loss function is minimized, our prediction will be as close as possible to the training labels. That is basically what we do with this logistic regression models. Now let's take a look at this logistic regression model again with the multiple instance learning framework at hand. So instead of n data points, we are given with n back of instances with binary labels 0 or 1. And because this is back of instances, each back of instances I will contain n I instances. And each of these instance will have features. And this is how usually, so for back I and the j instance, usually we write the feature like this, xij, xij1, xij2 until, okay, so there's a typo in this slide, so let me just correct it. Okay. Yes, so your features will be given by xij1, xij2, and the xijk. So meaning like each instance will have the same number, k features total. And when we apply logistic regression to the instance level, what we do is that we have these weight vectors, wk, and we'll multiply it with each instance features, and we'll apply the sigmoid function again. So this sigmoid function, if you remember, this will give us the probability, right? Between 0 and 1, because this is between 0 and 1. But instead of yi, like what we have in here, yi hat, which is the probability for like one data point, because this is multiple instance learning, what we have is a probability for each instance inside the back. So this yij hat is the probability that the j instance of the ith back has a label 1. So how do we learn the weight parameters in this case? So this is basically what we did with lab 2 previously. Because we can initialize any random value for this wk here, we can compute yij hat for all instance. So for the back of instances I, we can compute yi1 hat, yi2 hat, until yi hat. So these are the probability of each instance in this back I to have label 1. But of course, because we only have labels on the back level, what we need to do is we need to apply multiple instance assumption, capital H here, to combine the probability of all the ni instances to a single number yi hat. Previously, we applied the standard multiple instance learning assumption, or basically simply taking the maximum of all this probability to derive yi hat. Once we have the yi hat here, we can then compute the loss function and optimize the value with respect to W0 to Wm using the same cross entropy loss. And again, when this loss is minimized, our prediction on the back level will be as close as possible to the back labels. But this is done slightly differently because the way we optimize it is that this y I had here is not obtained directly, but this is obtained via the multiple instance assumption. So depending on the assumptions, so the assumption here, the multiple instance assumption here is what is critical with this process. So how do we optimize this? Well, before that, like let me draw an analogy, I guess. Like if you see this representation here, right? We represent this as like if as like a layer. So we have a layer of what we call neurons. We pass M features to this layer of neurons that comprises the weight vectors W0, W1, all the way to Wm. When we pass it through this layer, what this layer does to the feature input is that it will multiply them and apply some activation function before it outputs something. This representation, I mean, if some of you must be familiar with it, but this is like how we usually visualize an artificial neural network. An artificial neural network is basically like stacking a series of mathematical transformation on top of each other. This is similar just like our previous logistic regression, in which in each layer we do multiplication, we apply activation function, but instead of giving the output directly, we pass it through the next layer and performs the same operation all over again. So on each layer, we take input from the previous layer. We do matrix multiplication with some weight vectors that we are trying to learn, apply activation function. With logistic regression, we're constrained with the sigmoid activation function, but with neural network, we can have other optimization function, like some of the popular ones are the ReLU activation function, the hyperbolic tangent, and so on. The idea is that when we have these layers of mathematical transformation of this form, this can be used to approximate basically any well-behaved functions. And so this is like a very effective way to approximate like complicated relationship basically in our data. Again, this model is characterized by weight parameters on each layer and usually is optimized via minimizing this cross entropy loss. And maybe just to describe how we optimize it, usually we optimize our neural network, or even we can do this trick for logistic regression as well via gradient descent and backpropagation. What it means is that we can actually minimize. So we have a loss function L here, cross entropy loss, that we're trying to minimize. We know that this cross entropy loss is a function of all the parameters in the network. So this loss will change depending on how you change the weight parameters. And your goal is you want to change your weight parameters to the point that it minimizes this loss function over here. And people usually do this with gradient-based methods, meaning, so heuristically, it's like, so maybe just to draw an analogy, you have this loss function over here. So the y-axis here is the loss function value. The x-axis is the weight parameters. You know that the weight parameter changes, like as when you change the weight parameters, it also changes the value of this loss function. But in reality, this is not one-dimensional. This weight parameter is probably some high dimension, is located in very high dimensional space. But the way you want to optimize this is still, you want to find the direction in which when you change the weight parameters, it will decrease the loss function all the way up to the minimum. And the way we determine that direction is by computing the gradient, basically the gradient of the loss function, the rate of change of the loss function with respect to each weight parameter. And with neural network, we actually have this chain rule over here that basically links like how the loss changes with respect to the weight parameters. And I won't go through the details of this, but after you have the gradient or the direction of change, you can just update your weight parameter here. So gradient descent is just one of the many optimizers available in PyTorch. Previously in Lab 2, when we applied the logistic regression, we actually optimized the loss function for the logistic regression using similar methods, but instead of gradient descent, we used LBFGS algorithm, which is somewhat different from here, but is also gradient-based method. But the idea is that, like, with the recent advances in deep learning and with the availability of many programming framework to do deep learning, we can just, instead of focusing on how we optimize this, we can just use off-the-shelf optimizers and focus our effort on defining the loss functions and the network architecture. So what do I mean by that, by focusing on the loss function? So let's recall the instance-based methods that we have earlier. We have previously we trained a classifier, right, to learn the probability of the label given the instance. So this is the instance-based probability, and we have an assumption, right, that links all this probability to the ultimate back probability that we use to optimize. But if you think about it, right, we're not optimizing the back probability directly, but we're optimizing the back probability as a function of the aggregation of all the instance level probability. What we do is we're just specifying a loss function. We just specify how the back probability is related to the instance probability, and then we just like ask our model to learn the relationship on its own. Uh, Now with the neural based methods, we can even go one step further. Previously, this number, this probability, the instance level probability is basically a one-dimensional number, right, between 0 and 1 that we used to combine to form like to form the back level probability. But this is perhaps like this is also a form of compression, right, on the representation of the instance. Like if you think about it, like in the picture example, when previously we described like how when we describe the problem uh, of classifying a picture of a beach. Maybe let me go through to that example. If you remember this picture, right, we are assigning a number between 0 and 1 for each of this patch, whether they are responsible for this entire, whether a patch is responsible for the entire picture to be a picture of a beach, and the number is between 0 and 1. But the patch might contain like more information, right? Like first, it is related with the other patches, uh, and it might contain our information that is useful that we probably don't know. Well, in this case, it might be like if like suppose if we assign a label to this, if we assign a label to each patch, the label might correspond to like the class of the patch, right? So this is a picture of the water, but it can also contain some other information, right? It can also contain things like the time of the day, the presence of wind, because like in beach you usually observe like wind, and because it's not a still body of water, you can indicate this is a body of water, but if you see the ripples, it might contain waves as well, for example, and that is a characteristic of a beach, right? And that might be different from patch to patch. And the point of me saying all that is that when we just assign a number between 0 and 1, a one-dimensional number for this, we are sort of reducing the available information that is contained in that patch, right? So while it is interpretable in a way, it might not be the most optimized representation, meaning we can actually try to do something more. We can try to assign like higher dimensional number for this quantity p of l given xij here, instead of just probability. We can assign like an arbitrary length vector, for example, that we will combine later to do classification. Of course, this comes at a cost of interpretability, but in some cases this might even improve like classification performance. So then this brings us to the third method to solve multiple instance learning problem. It's called the embedded space methods. So this is somewhat really, this is like a combination of both back-based methods in which we are dealing with back representation and with instance-based methods in which we're trying to assign some probability to each instance. But the main difference is that instead of predicting instance level probability, we're trying to transform the instance. So suppose we have two neural network, right? We have instance neural network and back level neural network. What we're doing is that for each instance in our back, we apply f. So if this f of x gives you a number between 0 and 1, so this is just like our previous instance classifier. But if we can set this f to output the high dimensional number, for example, then we can apply a pulling function m that is permutation invariant, meaning no matter what the order of the instance that we pass to m must give the same results. So it also must be able to take an arbitrary Lang vector and output a fixed representation. Because like each back might contain different number of instances, so M must be able to deal with that. What is the example of this? Max function, for example, or minimum function would take in all this and output a fixed representation. So there is one example. Then after we apply M to all this transform instance, we can apply another neural network G to take in this fixed representation to finally output the back probability. So the difference between this and the instance-based method is that in instance-based method, we have the multiple instance assumptions that we came up with our own. And we force this f of xi to be probability number. But in this case, we add more flexibility to the representations. And this sort of encapsulates the idea that we want the data to we want to, the data to learn by we want the model to just learn from the data with as little influence from the humans that code this thing. This is actually not without motivation. So there is actually a mathematical motivation for this. And the motivation is that suppose we have a function s, right, that takes in features from each instance and perfectly assign the back label. So suppose we have that function that assigns like, so if we have a picture of a beach, a picture of a cat, we have a function that will that when we fit the patches from this image and we fit to that function will assign the correct back label perfectly. Suppose we have that. And that function is symmetric, meaning like it doesn't care about the order that we pass our instances to. And suppose it is Hausdorff continuous. So this is a technical topological term. Might not, we don't need to concern ourselves with this because we can just assume this, at least for most practical application. And the theory says that this function s, which is something that we wish to learn because this is like the rules behind our multiple instance learning data, this function apparently can be arbitrarily approximated by a function in the form of this. So if you remember this form earlier, this m here is a point function. We can replace that with just a maximum function. So if we take maximum over all the instances across all the dimension of the instance and we apply in our neural network G, we can in fact like approximate this function s that we want to learn to arbitrary precision. So this is like sort of the motivation why we want to do this end to end with a neural network, because the theory says like if s is if there is that function s, we can then approximate it arbitrarily basically. Yes, and that brings us to the third lab. But before that, is there any question? Okay, if not, I'll post the link for the third lab on the chat. Can I'm using the chat. Give me a moment. Okay, that's the link for third lab. Okay, give me a moment. Okay, yep, sharing my screen. And yeah, let's begin the third lab. Yeah, so as before, for this third lab, yeah, we're again working with Google Colab. We're working with the amnes digits again, but we have slightly changed the labels, the rules that I use for the labels. But yeah, we can just like run as usual. It should run the first cell to clone the data and trust the notebook. You're cloning the repo again so that we can download the data. Refresh this, and if you've successfully done the first step, you'll see this folder called MI Workshop. Then we can run this import. Should add this torch manual seat 0. Okay, we should import torch. So add import torch line here. Then you should run this so that we're set. So that we just want to make sure that the whole thing is replicable. Then again, run the data loading cell below it. I'm sure by now you should be familiar with all this. But if you're not, let me just quickly go through the variables again. Again, like our instances are represented by this variable called xtrain. And if you see xtrain has a shape of 20,000 by 64, basically we have 20,000 instances, and each instance has a dimensionality of 64. Each of these instance belongs to Bex, and the Beck is represented by this variable called trainbacks. And if you see, this trainbacks is basically just a list of lists. So if you type trainback 0, this will give you the indices of the instance in xtrain that belongs to back 0. And for you to access that instance, you need to type xtrain square bracket trainback square bracket, and you put in the index of the back that you want to access to. So in this case, if you want to access the 0th back, you access trainback 0, pass it to xtrain, and this will give you all the instances that belongs to the 0th back. So you can type dot shape here. You see there are 4 instances that belong to the 0th back, and each one of them has a dimension of 64. And what about the label, you say? Well, the label is given by this variable called train labels. So if you type in train labels, you have an array containing 0 and 1, a train label 0. This will give you the label of the 0th back. So if you want to access the 5th instance, 5th backs, you can pass trainbacks 5 to xtrain, then you get 5 instances of dimension 64. And to find out what the label, you type train labels 5, and this will give you the label. In this case, it is 0. Again, we're going to work with the train data, and we want to train with the test data. So for each of these xtrain, trainbacks, and train labels, we have the variable xtest, which is of, so we have 10,000 instance for the test data, but for the test backs, we only have 2,000 backs in total. So in average, there are roughly 5 instances per back, probably. But yeah, we can visualize that first. We want to visualize whether the distribution of labels in the training and test sets are the same. So again, to do that, I'm just gonna do what I've done before for the first 2 lab session. can just copy me. I'm going to plot the label distribution. So this is just like a good sanity check, I guess, to make sure that there's nothing weird going on with your data. So you can plot histogram of the train labels and the test labels to see the distribution of the labels in these two bags. And as you can see, they're roughly of equal proportion between these two bags. We have two labels, 0 or 1. And clearly, we don't have a lot of ones here. And this will be a problem later when we train our classifier. Similarly, we can copy the cell and we can visualize the distribution of the number of instances across the training and test set. And to do that, we plot the histogram of the land bag or bag and train bags. So this will print the histogram that contains the length of each bag inside the training bag. And I can do the same for the test bags. And yeah, we can see that the instances ranges from 3 to 6 in both training and test bags. So I'm just, yes, so if you're interested to run this code, yeah, I'm just gonna leave it here. Maybe we can wait 1 minute before we progress with the next part.
Yeah, just so that I'm not confused, right? So
Yep.
everything, every single label within the bag is the same, right?
Every single label
every
within the bag.
As in every single instance within the bag has the same label, right?
Yes. So our label only makes sense for the in terms of the bag.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and maybe in regards to that question, right? We can try to visualize the instance again in the positive bags. So the thing is, right, with multiple instance learning problem. So maybe we just visualize this, train bags, train labels, and try to visualize 5 bags at a time. You can, okay, so you need to run this cell first. Then you can try to visualize the bags. This time, let's try to visualize just 5 bags. And so, yeah, to answer your question, right, if you see, we have multiple bags in here. Each bag has a label 1 or 0. And the problem with multiple instance learning is that sometimes it might not make sense to talk about instance labels. Because in the sense, we know that the instance inside each bag is a picture, right? Is an image of a digit. And when we say label, it can belong to many things, right? It can mean the probability of this particular image being assigned to this back label 1. It can also be the class that it represents, right? Like this is a digit 5, this is a digit 0, this is a digit 9, for example. So it can be any of those. So the back label in this case only makes sense up to the back level, while the instance can have many important information or not so important information that relates to the back labels. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah. So if you visualize this, you see that I think for this, the rule is that if you contain a digit 9 and 6, I think it's labeled as 1. Or I think if it contains 9, it's considered label 1. If it contains 9 and 6, it's also labeled 1. But if only 6, I don't exactly remember, but this has some kind of composite rules to it, I think. Let me check. Oh, sorry, it's not 9 and 6. So in this example, I think I've created such that it is labeled 1 if it contains 9 and 5. But if it contains only 9 or only 5, like for example this back, it contains a digit 5, but it's labeled 0. So this is slightly more complicated because it involves 2 different digits.
Quick question. I understand it's the MIST data set, right? But do they actually recognize that, for example, the first picture is 5, and maybe I think your last row, that the second picture is also 5, right? They are slightly
Yes.
different, right?
Yes.
Internally, are they recognizing it's a digit 5, or we are just passing in the pixel information for each image?
So internally, right, what we do know is that what we're passing is like, I think I described previously, but
Yeah, I think you mentioned.
we are just like passing some vectors that supposedly captures that idea.
Oh, okay, yes, yeah, okay, sure.
Yes. So ideally, the model should somewhat like can tell like which one is closer to which one.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
sure.
But of course, like yeah, sometimes we're not sure if that is what the model is learning, I guess. Yeah. Yep. Anyway, so let's run some codes. Okay, so for this lab session, I think I'm going to go through like the methods that we use to like. I'm going to be talking about PyTorch a bit. So I don't know if any of you is familiar with PyTorch before. Anyone uses PyTorch in their research or in their work? Well, regardless, like yeah, I'm gonna go through the concept with PyTorch while we're running like some of the models, and yeah, maybe if you have any questions, you can always ask. So let's execute the next cell. Let's just like run all this. So if you want, you can run this chunk of code. I've run it before, so as you can see, I have like the performance in here. Basically, what I'm trying to do here, I ran the logistic regression with multiple instance assumption, but instead of taking the maximum probability of the instance, we are averaging the probability of each instance and making prediction. And as you can see, it doesn't perform very well. It's an accuracy of just 50%, which is essentially just random. Uh, we can try like different mode of logistic regression MI here. You can change the mean with max, for example, but still, I think it wouldn't. I ran it before and I have it here, but it won't give you like performance that is very, very good. But instead, what we're going to run here is this. We're going to have a more fluid representation with the model, and we're going to run a neural network model instead. So you can just like run this cell over here to activate and to define the model class, and you can just run the training loop here. And oh, it's really fast, but it's not really learning anything, which is weird. I think something is wrong. Oh, right. Yes, I know what's wrong. Okay. Initialize loss function optimizer. Okay, now we're going to implement a training loop for this model. So usually with neural network model, so I've defined the model here. I'm going to go through what each of these block actually does later as while we're waiting for the models. But for now, to initialize a neural network, we need to have a loss function. So now we're going to define the loss function here. And the loss functions that we're going to use, let's call it criterion. We are going to use what we call the binary cross entropy loss with logits. So we can just type nn dot bce with logit loss. We pass weight vectors here. which we have defined here, and I'm going to explain that again. Okay, and we're going to run this on CPU because I can't be sure that we can get GPU access with Google Colab. Sometimes I can get one, sometimes I don't. Okay, and we're going to define an optimizer here. So this optimizer will, the function of this optimizer is that it will tune our parameters. So we're going to use Adam optimizer in here. And we're going to pass in the parameters of our model. This optimizer will try to tune these parameters such that it minimizes this loss over here. And let's pause for e minus 3 as the learning rate. This learning rate controls how aggressive we are adjusting the weight parameters of the model. And after we set these two criteria here, we're just going to implement the training loop. So the way this optimizer works is that it will go through the entire data set each time, and it will compute the loss function and update the model and repeat the process again and again. So one pass through the data set is called an epoch, and the number of epochs the number of epochs that we set will tell the model like how long should the model optimize this, like how many passes through the data sets should it go through. So previously I accidentally execute this thing, this whole cell without training the model. If you can see, we can see some performance, balance accuracy of just 0.5. So this is basically the performance of the model when it is randomly initialized. It's not trained yet with the training data, and it has it's essentially just randomly predicting the test data. That's why we have a balance accuracy of 0.5. Now we're going to train the model, and hopefully we can see some improvement in the model. So the way we train the model is we're going to run the model through 100 passes through the data because the data is not very large and the model is not very large either. This should finish in less than 5 minutes. And so we're going to create a training loop. And we're going to train the model according to the number of epochs. So we're going to loop it through the number of epochs. Each time, it's always a good practice to set the training mode for the model. And after that, we also need to perform this optimizer zero grad. Basically with PyTorch, the way this programming framework works is that we can optimize the model because PyTorch keep track of the gradients being computed for each weight parameter. So that's why on each pass of the data set, every time our model will compute a new gradient, we should zero these grads so that we should run optimizer zero grad so that the model doesn't keep the gradient being accumulated from the previous pass through the training data. After that, we can run our prediction. So this might be a bit confusing for you if you are not familiar with PyTorch or neural network training in general. So no problems. I will upload the updated Google Colab page, and you can go through on your own. So this will at least give you some reference or a point to start on training your own neural network model. So our model takes in the training instances, the X train vector, and the training backs that will tell us how the instances are being grouped. And remember, we have the loss function. So we should compute the loss function, which is given by this BCE with logit loss. So we just compute the loss, which is between our output of the model, and with Torch, everything must be converted to tensor. So if your data is a NumPy array, you need to convert it with torch.tensor. And you pass in the actual labels, which is the training labels. And there you have the loss function. And in order to compute the gradient update, you need to do loss.backward. This will compute the gradients of the loss with respect to all the parameters. Then you can run optimizer.step, which will update your model. So with just this, you can execute this code. Okay, there's an error. Oh, okay. So there's a mismatch in shape. Let me troubleshoot this real fast. Okay. So you can flatten this output. So this output and this labels will have the same shape. And you can just run this again and wait for a while. Now, while we're waiting for the training, let's take a look at the model that we have. So this is our model, neural network multiple instance learning model, which I called NNMI. This NNMI takes in 3 arguments. First, the encoder, second, the decoder, and third, the mode. So what does this do? So let's look at the definition of this model above. So this is the neural network multiple instance learning model. With Torch neural network model, the way you make prediction is defined in this forward method. This will tell you how you work with the with the input data. So first it takes in X. So it is worth noting here is X is the instance level features. Okay, so it will take X, which is the instance level. In this case, our variable X train and X test. And we'll also take indices variable. So indices is the back is the list of indices that group the instance features to the backs. So in this case, our indices is our train backs or test backs variable. So let's see what does the model do. First, what the model does is it transforms our X with this function called encoder, which is what we passed originally to the model. So after applying this encoder, this model will then, depending on the mode, if it is maximum, it will take the maximum of all the instances of the instances within each back for each of the features. So what does that mean? That means that what this model do is, suppose you have a back, right, containing 3 instances. So for simplicity, let's suppose the instance is just, we have 3 instances. The first instance is described by just 3 vectors, three numbers. So first instance is 1, 2, 3. Second instance is 4, 5, 6. Third instance is 7, 8, 9. So you have 3 instances here, each described with the same length vector. First, you pass all these instances through an encoder function. What this do is that this will apply transformation according to the encoder function. For this example, we define our encoder as this: neural nn.sequential, nn.linear, relu, linear, relu. So again, this might be confusing if you're not familiar with neural network training or PyTorch. But basically, in a nutshell, what these do is this linear function will take in a vectors of length 64, and it will multiply it with a matrix and output a vector of length 128. So this encoder operation consists of multiplying your input of dimension 64, outputting a dimension 128. After that, you work sequentially, as the name suggests, and you apply this ReLU function, which basically just adds some nonlinearity. You can look at this similar to how you look the sigmoid function, for example, although they do different things. But Basically, this just makes like all values that is below 0 to be 0. Then, but this in general doesn't change the dimensionality of your output, which is why the next time you apply another linear layer, you must expect an input of size 128, because like the previous layer output size 128, then you output another size 64. So what this do is then with respect to this variable over here, if we have a bag of instances with 3 instances, each of length. So maybe if we want to make it the same as here, let's expand this to length 64, up to 64. Then this is 4, 5, 6, all the way to, I don't know, 68. And this is all the way to 71. You apply some multiplication that will transform this to 128 lines vector. So we don't know what the output will be, but let's just say this is like A1, A2, all the way to A128. So there is the first instance. We'll do the same to the second instance, B1, B2, all the way to B101 to 8. And for the third instance as well, C1, C2, all the way to C1 to 8. So that is what the first linear will do. Let's just assume this ReLU does nothing. It doesn't do nothing, but in general, it changes the value, but we're still left with the same length vector. Then we apply another transformation that transforms this 128 to 64. And we have like another representation, right? Maybe D1 to D64. And we have E1 to A64. And we have F1 to F64. So that's what the encoder does. Here, what it do is it acts on each instance and transform it through a series of through a series of matrix multiplications and nonlinear with the layer like the ReLU, and outputs higher dimensional and output a different function basically.
Yeah, I have a question here. Maybe you already explained it, but what is the purpose behind this encoder and decoder setup? I mean, let's say for example, this decoder, right, has 64 into 128 and then 128 into 64, right?
Yes.
If I just bring the first line to the encoder, will it make any difference? Meaning that
Okay.
we have the first line of the decoder, which is NN linear 64, 128, right? If I bring this up to the last item of the encoder, will it make any difference in the processing?
So this encoder and decoder actually acts differently. So I haven't gone through here.
Oh, okay.
So basically what this encoder does is that it acts on the instance level. So it transforms each instance into some kind of representation. Okay. So after that, if you see the code, right, after this goes through the encoder, it applies what we call a pulling function. Because
I don't see the pulling function.
So this pulling is slightly different from what you know in the neural network pulling.
Okay.
Like because our input is bag of instances, right? And each bag contains different number of instances. So you want to compress them into a fixed size representation, basically.
Okay. I see. So before the encoder gets fed into the decoder, it goes through this.
Yep. So there's this line here, actually.
Okay. Then I get it now. Okay, sure.
Yes. So previously, right, when we're working with a single instance logistic regression, this encoder outputs like a probability, and we just take the maximum of that probability and output that as the back probability.
Yes.
But in this case, it is slightly different, because instead of outputting like a number between 0 and 1, this outputs like high dimensional vectors for each instance. Then what we do is that we collect like we gather all instances that belong to the same bag in this loop over here. So say we use max. Yes. Then we take the maximum across each of these features.
Okay.
So if we take max, right, for this particular back, we're going to end up with this representation.
Okay.
Max of D1, E1, F1. We have max of D2, E2, F2. And we're going to have max of D3, E3, and F3.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so now this will have like a fixed size. So in general, like from here, 64 dimension for each instance. Then we, in this block, we summarize them. Only then we pass through the decoders. So this decoder takes in the back representation. Yes, and outputs probability. Yep, so I can. Okay, I realize this is not very. Yeah, I can just leave it here and just comment them out. Yep, so in the nutshell, that's what it does. Yeah. And wow, it's still training. Okay. I think last time I remember it wasn't this long, but yeah, then let's wait up a bit. Okay, let's wait one more minute. If this doesn't stop, I think I can just like explain like the subsequent session before we continue with this. Yep. Okay, this is taking longer than what I expected, so maybe I'll just go through the next section, and hopefully by the time we finish that, we can observe some results. If not, I can just tell you, I guess, what to expect from that. So anyway, like if we look at this training loop again, what we're doing here is that we're making the model predict. So we set the number of epochs here to be 100. So what we're doing is we're going through 100 passes of the data, and on each pass we make the model predict the probability that it thinks like the training data should have, the labels that the training data should have, and we compute like how different is that labels from what we expect, compute the error, and try to make the model minimize. So in general, we do about 100 times. We do 100 steps of minimization because on each pass through the data set, we do that minimization. But yeah, we are lucky because in the sense that in this one, we are using like a small model. So this can be run through CPU. And if you look at the RAM, right, we're only using 1.24 gigabytes because our data is relatively small. But when we're dealing with neural networks in general, usually you need a lot of data, and your data is usually like an image, for example, or a text or a signal, date like an electrical signal or anything, but that usually has quite a high dimensionality. So this usually tends to be quite burdensome. This can take quite a heavy burden on your memory. And so what we're doing here is usually not possible to be done when you are when I say that, I mean like here we are making the model outputs probability for all the data at once, and usually this is not something that you can do in practical usually in practice. But instead what you can do is that you can just sample part of this data and feed it like feed it subsequentially to the to the model, so that that way you don't have to make prediction for all the data, but you can just make prediction for the small part of the data, compute the loss, you do the updating and repeat. So in this way, like we are saving the memory that we need to do, because we need to have in order to run this training, and usually like this is the more manageable way to do things. And how do we do that? In PyTorch, usually the way we do that is by defining this thing called a data set and a data loader. So maybe to demonstrate, we can just uncomment this entire thing, and we're going to define what we call data set. So a data set will tell you how to, a data set is basically a Python class that will tell you like how to access the data. And when we pass it through the data loader, Torch will handle the partitioning of the data by itself. So maybe for this example, I'm just going to code it. Maybe you can look through later for reference. But the data set, basically for the multiple instance learning, you need to be able to, at each time, you need to be able to output like all the instances in a bag. Uh, so first, we need to save within our data set like the instances that we're going to use. So this, let's just make this data set takes in 3 arguments: the instance, the bags, and the labels. And let's just save like all the information in our data set. Yep. Then you need to define what is called what is termed as the get item method. Oh, okay, our training is done. And as you can see, we can achieve a balanced accuracy of 85% with this neural network with the more fluid representations, in which we don't constrain like our model to have to the output probability for a single instance, as opposed to when we train a logistic regression where we only get performance that is no better than random, because with this data it's slightly more complicated. Yeah, so there's the benefit of this, but of course the trade-off is that by doing it this way, we lose interpretability in the sense that each back that we predict as positive, we generally don't know what it focuses on. Like we don't know like which instances which instances contribute to the back prediction and so on. But depending on the application, this trade-off can of course be useful because this usually comes with a huge boost in accuracy. So yes, again, like let me go through the dataset example. So when you are designing a torch dataset, you need to design this dataset class. You need to implement this method called getItem, which will basically, if you remember the xtrain example, our xtrain variable, it's an array, right? Or it's a matrix, and you can access like its row by having this square bracket, and you put some numbers. So xtrain 0 will give you the instance that corresponds to the 0th row of xtrain. With dataset for multiple instance learning, we can set it such that when we input some number like 0, so it will be this get item, this index argument here, it will output the 0th back. So it will output all the instance that belong to that back. So to do that, we just have to return self.the instance, and we pass the necessary backs, because if you remember, if we want to access instance from the 0th back, or we just pass train backs 0, for example, to xtrain. So this is like similar to that. And for dataset, because we want to use this for training, we need to pass the label as well. So make it return the back label that corresponds to that particular back. Lastly, we need to define the length of the dataset, which means like how many items are there in this dataset. So because this dataset outputs the back of instances, so this length should be equal to the number of back inside. So return len of self.x. Then once we have this data set, we can define a training data set and a test data set by passing like the required arguments. So for data set, we need the xtrain argument, the train backs argument, and the train labels argument. And this will output what we want. So for example, if we just run this code, we do train data set, and we access like the 0th back, for example, it will output us 3 things, right? So it will output 3 things. So let's just call them back 1. Oh, it will output the things. So just let's call them like back of instances and labels and label. And we run this. And in general, we're going to have, so if we look at back of instances, it will contain all the instances that belongs to the 0th back. And if we look at label, we'll have like the corresponding label. So why do we need to create data set? Because in Torch, if we want to train a neural network sequentially, we cannot pass all the data at once to the model. We must pass it sequentially, like just a small chunk of the data at the time. This is managed in Torch by this class called data loader, and this data loader will expect a data set. So you pass data set to it, and you can set the number of processors that you want to load the data. So the benefit of setting this is that you can utilize more CPU to load all the data more efficiently. And the most important argument here is perhaps the batch size over here. So the batch size over here will determine like how many data that you want to use, like for each training loop, for each training iteration. And usually you want to set shuffle equal to true, so that like at each pass you sort of mix up the data for better generalization performance. And last, you need this call-it function that will tell you how to combine like multiple results from the data set at once. So you can look through this later. Yeah, for now, like I'll just leave it at here, and you can like wait on your own later. But maybe what I'm going to show you is how to implement a training loop with this setup. So first, we just copy what we have before. Yeah, so after we copy this code, so remember this code, what we're doing here is we are passing the entire data at once for each epochs. Now, since we want to do this sequentially, we need to create another loop in here. Well, probably in here. And we can set it like this. We can write it like this. For feature and labels and indices in iter train DL. So what we're doing here is that we are asking our train data loader to fetch us like inputs sequentially. And each time, since our data loader, because like our model requires the instance features, the back labels, and the back index each time, we expect these three outputs from the data loaders. And each time we'll make prediction. Instead of like taking the entire X train at once, we just input the feature and we input the indices. And we will compute just this mini batch output. We will compute the loss with respect to the mini batch labels. And we update each time. And we can run it just like before. Oh, there's an error. Oh, okay. Zero, but got argument numpy array. Okay. Okay, so one thing that I forgot to tell you is that with Torch, you expect the dataset to have a tensor output. So since this X is a numpy array, you have to convert it to tensor with this with this thing called torch.tensor. And you will convert the label as such too. Then you can run the training code. There's still error. Tuple index out of range. Okay. So, okay, because like we need the index information, so each time we load the data set, we should also tell the data loader how many instances are there in the back. So we should also output these quantities here. So yeah, this is probably like a bit hard to explain in full, but when you have the time, you should play around with this notebook so that you have better idea on how to run this. Okay, this is a typo in here. Size of a tensor must match the size of a singleton. Okay, it seems that there are many problems with this. Let me just try to debug it real fast. That is weird. Oh, okay, I know what's wrong. So this chunk of code shouldn't be here. So basically in this setting, right, when we are training, because our data is not exactly balanced, and usually like the neural network doesn't really perform well when the labels are in balance between the positive class and the negative class. What we're doing here is that instead of just using the normal loss function, we're passing this weights argument, which basically just mean like you assign higher weightage when computing the loss to the label that is of minority, so that like your prediction won't be biased to 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 the to the to the to the majority classes. So yeah, so I'm going to upload this notebook again later. And yes, you can play around with the updated notebook later. So I'm not gonna wait for this code to run, but I've run this before. The performance is not very different from when we run like the complete neural network. Yes, so that is the end of lab 3. Yeah, again, I'll update this, so yeah, don't worry. Now, like, let me get back to the presentation. Usually we have breaks in between the workshop, but we don't have that much left on the slide, so I'm just going to finish the workshop. Then we can just like go back to our days. Yep. So lab 3. So this is basically what we did with lab 3. Previously, if you remember, with the multiple instance learning instance-based classification, we want like our model to output like a probability for each instance. But of course, with the embedded space method, this is not a requirement. Instead of outputting a single probability for each instance, we can set like this quantity f of xij for each instance xij to output an arbitrarily length vector that then which will then like apply this m, which is a pulling function to all the instance inside the back to get a back representation. Again, this m that we did before is a max function because like it must be permutation invariant. It doesn't have to be the max function. You can take average or product or other functions, but in general, this m must be permutation invariant, and usually max tends to work quite well for our example. It is no longer the standard MI assumption, but in this case, like we are giving our model a higher degree of flexibility in learning representations to classify the multiple instance learning problem. So this is what I said before. In practice, it's not always easy to learn in this setting because like with the gradient-based optimization, right? So if you have a max function here, we apply max to each dimension of the transform instance representation. Gradient tends to flow only to one of the instances. And with the presence of multiple local optima, usually like this becomes like quite hard to learn because like you don't exactly being very efficient in updating your gradient. In practice, you can substitute this m with other functions than max. For example, with mean function, your gradient can flow through more of the instances, softmax function, etc. So in recent years, so just now we have applied like a very simple neural network to deal with multiple instance learning problem. But in the literature, especially like with more and more neural network architectures being out, with more new neural network architectures being out there, people have tried to incorporate some of the neural ideas to neural networks, and this is one of it. It's called deep supervision methods. Basically, what it says is that instead of just having one single pooling layers like what we did before. So this is what we did before. We have backup instances. We apply to like several layers of neural network to transform like the feature representation of the instances. Apply multiple instance learning pooling layer. In this case, probably the max function. Then we output back score. Instead of just doing this, we can do something more. For example, when we apply like when we pass our backup instances through multiple layers, in between each layer, we can apply separate pooling and have a separate prediction for each intermediate output here. So like after we pass through the first fully connected through the first linear layer, we can apply a pooling layer, output a probability, but continue this flow of input in this direction and output several probability, and we can average these predictions during test time. So the benefit of this is that you can then ensure that the even from the start of your neural network, even from after just one pass through a linear layer, you can have like a better feature quality that is already quite informative enough. And in this way, it sort of helps with the training of your network, because like you're forcing your network in each step to learn like good features that are good enough to be able to be used for like classifications like at the final against the final output. Another another examples that have been another like neural network architectures that are very popular is of course the ResNet, or the one with residual connections. This has been found to be good, of course, because this allows people to train like very deep network, because like with the residual connection you allow the gradient to flow better. uh, and this has also been adapted to multiple instance learning framework, in which like for each layer, for each instance, after you pass it through like a layer of through a linear layer, you can apply some pooling methods, and you can do a skip connection here, in which the output of this after a pooling layer, you add it with like the output of the next layer, and in this case like so this sort of mimics like the residual connection that you have in ResNet. And this allows you, of course, to train like deeper and deeper multiple instance learning networks. Again, like the output of this is not necessarily interpretable, but usually you tend to have like better classification performance at the end. So far we have seen deep supervision and residual connection being applied to multiple instance learning problem. And if we look back at what multiple instance learning really is, it involves learning rules that assigns individual instances to its back labels. These rules might be something that you approximate with neural networks, so that not necessarily interpretable. It may be something that you have domain knowledge about, so you can use the multiple instance learning assumption and you begin the learning process on the instance level. But in most cases, the assignment rules can be complex. For example, if you remember about the picture of a beach that we have previously, it's not entirely clear, right? Like how you combine like the different patches containing sea and containing water and containing sand together. Like, is it like if they are present beyond a certain threshold, are they enough to classify whether a picture is a picture of a beach? Or do we need like, I don't know, or does this threshold changes depending on the resolution of the pictures? It's hard to learn because we have variable number of instances and a lot of problems like with this like handcrafted rules, right? And then the question is, can we adapt other recent neural network idea to multiple instance learning problem? And the answer is like recently, one of the most cited multiple instance learning method has been using this idea from from uh, from from neural language processing, natural language processing, or NLP, which is the attention mechanism, which has been really popular recently. And there we have attention mechanism in multiple instance learning too. So what we do is that previously we apply pooling function like maximum pooling. So suppose we have back xi and we have each instances hi1, hi2, all the way to hi. So there are ni instances for this back, and they've been transformed through some neural networks or other functions basically. Yeah. Then instead of just taking the maximum across the dimension of all these instances, you can actually sort of measure how similar these instances are to each other. And after measuring the similarity, you can come up with this variable ak that assigns like that basically is the normalized similarity of all these instances. Uh, then you can compute the linear combination of, then to get a back representation, you can compute the linear combination of all the instance within that back through this formula sigma k, ak, hk. So this is just a linear combination because this ak sums up to 1. And this ak is basically just the normalized, the relative, like, this is just like the relative weightage of all of them, of all the instances to each other. And you measure their contribution to the back representation at the end, and you learn this end to end. So systematically, what you do is first you have ni instances. You map them through a neural network F to obtain fxi1 all the way to f of xi and I. Then you compute a weight vectors for all of this, and you compute the back representation by taking linear combination of all these instances. The benefit of this against the as opposed to the max function is that this is like a softmax functions. If you think about not softmax, it's like a weighted combination. It's like a weighted average of all these instances, right? So that instead of just taking the maximum, which is just one instance, this allows gradient to flow through all the instances because like you consider the contribution of each instances together. But what is more important with this mechanism is that these attention weights, this AI1 all the way to AI-NI, can be useful. In what way? So this is like one of the toy example that the paper presents. So this is similar with the example, the toy amnes problem that we have during the lab sessions. So I think in this problem, a back is called positive if it contains at least one digit of 9. And if you see, the author actually plots all the weight of all the attention weight of all the images. And if you look at the highest attention weight that network assigns to all the images, it actually assigns the highest weightage to the numbers, digit 9, that is responsible for the classification of this back. So this attention weight, like, it's sort of a trade-off, like, because previously with instance-based methods we can have like instance-based probability, but then like the performance might not be very good because we need to have multiple instance learning assumption that constrains like the flexibility of the representation of our model. But then with neural network we have more flexible representations, but we lose interpretability. But with this attention weight, this sort of like try to marry the two, in which we still have flexible representation, but we also have some degree of interpretability. And the reason why this interpretability is useful, so this is another work, recent work, in which basically we're trying to classify whether this is a fundoscopic image. Basically, it's an image scan of an eye. And the problem here is to classify whether this image belongs to someone with diabetic retinopathy or not. So diabetic retinopathy is a condition that afflicts the eye. Usually like it afflicts patients with diabetes, and in like several number of years, it will eventually lead to blindness. And usually you can recognize this by looking at the scans, and you look for artifacts like this. You see the yellow spots over here. These are usually the features that ophthalmologists look uh, in order to diagnose patients with diabetic retinopathy. So clearly this is a picture of someone with diabetic retinopathy. And the one on the right is the attention map learned by the model that predicts that this is a diabetic retinopathy image. And if you see, this attention seems to, the high intensity value here corresponds to the patches with high attention weights. And if you can see, they seem to be centered around like those area that actually contains the spots that we think is responsible, right, for classifying this. So imagine like you're a doctor and you want to automate this process, right? Like, because the number of diabetic patients like increases every year, and we have a lot. And so at some point, there's actually like a reason to automate this. You run your model through like database of patients, and say the model like selects the model like picks out 5 to 6 patients with diabetic retinopathy. Then before you start like prescribing medicine or proceed with further treatments, you need, as a doctor, as a physician, you need to do some sort of quality control, right? And like this makes it easier, right? Because like when we have with like problem that requires some degree of interpretability like this, and you have results that are interpretable, this will be very useful for the for especially like for the clinicians, right, to look at. So this is like a recent advances in multiple instance learning, and while like representing the problem as multiple instance learning can be useful, like usually if you just represent this as a classification problem and you use a convolutional neural network to classify this, usually it's not as easy to obtain like the weights. While with multiple instance learning, you have like a direct interpretability from the way you model the problems, because you consider this as like collection of patches of the image, and each patch contribute differently to the prediction of this. And usually it's more straightforward to obtain like this sort of information that allows you to interpret the results. So the multiple instance learning, right, in summary, it have seen a lot of improvements since it was first introduced in 1997. Current research focuses on more flexible representation of the back of instances, especially like with the advances of neural-based techniques. People are trying to apply more and more of the new neural-based architectures to multiple instance learning. And of course, the big question is with this is that you want to have some sort of informations on the instance level, which you usually don't have the labels from. And so like there are a lot of works to make this more and more interpretable, especially in the domain of biomedical images and so on. So far, a few works have explicitly incorporated dependence between instances. Like in this case, for example, the back of instances for this task is usually the image patches, and we know they are not independent of each other, right? There are some sort of dependencies between like neighboring patches, for example. And so few works have have like really analyzed the quality of the prediction and so on. So there are definitely still a lot of things to work on this area. And yeah, I hope if there's anything, like I hope this workshop at least informs you, make you aware of the presence of this particular technique and framework to solve a machine learning problem. And hopefully, yeah, just increase like the number of tools in your arsenals to solve whatever problem it is that you might encounter. So maybe to summarize, again, multiple instance learning is a form of weak supervision learning in which we are given back of instances, but we are only given labels on the back labels or on the back, but we have like a lot of instances inside the backs that might or might not have the same labels as the backs. There are generally three approaches to tackle these problems: back-based methods, instance-based methods, and embedded space methods. And of course, as we have seen, the effectiveness of each of these approach is domain and application specific. So yeah, so that's all for this workshop. Is there any question? Okay, so if there's no more question, or if you have like questions that, or if I don't know or if you have questions after this workshop that you want to ask, you can always send an email to me. I realize I forgot to include my email in this slide. I think like we can probably send the slides to all of you along with the link to the Google Colab, and I'll include my emails there. So if there's anything, feel free to contact me through emails or yeah. So we'll be happy to chat more about this topic. So yeah, that's all for this workshop. Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending, and thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Prof. Sam. Are you guys still there? So I think like I will update the sites, probably like just fix a bit of things and include some contact information so that people who are interested to know more about this can ask me again later. Then probably I'll contact all of you through emails. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to organize, and thank you for helping to organize this.